My name is John, and hopefully my friends, when they think of me as a friend. My dad was flying in the South Pacific in World War II and stationed in the San Francisco area, and I was actually born in San Mateo. And my parents were originally pre-World War II, when they were married, were both from Denver, although they weren't native Denverites, but came back to Denver at the end of the war, shortly after I was born. And we were in Denver for 13 years, and then my father was asked to be the manager of the Empire Savings office up here in Longmont. It was a new office for Empire, and so we moved up to Longmont in 1958 when I was 13 years old, and I've been here ever since. And I've felt like, I've had all the opportunities that anybody could ever hope for. When we were in Denver, I went to a grade school and had a great educational experience, 6 years, and went to junior high, and my three grades, 7, 8, and 9, and seventh grade, there were close to 2,000 kids in the junior high. And we moved to Longmont, so I was one of the eighth graders at Central, and there's several hundred kids, and I think there were two classes of eighth graders, so I became a big fish in a small pond. And went on to high school, 4-year high school, and enjoyed that immensely. And Longmont at that point was about 10,000 people, and it was one high school, and I was fortunate. Got to play football, baseball, and basketball, and we had the basketball games at the Memorial Building, because the school was at 9th and Main. That was where the school was. The football games were at Roosevelt Park. There was a grandstand on the south side of the park, actually a very large grandstand. And so in front of the grandstand was the football field, in the winter the skating rink, and in the summer the fairgrounds. And it was, and so it was, and everybody went to the games on Friday night, and there was another building there called the TAC Club, Teenage Canteen, and they had records, and we'd go dance after the games, it was just a smaller, more intimate environment, and you went places and you always knew people, and there weren't that many. Really, there weren't any what I would call, quote, nice restaurants. We had some cafes, and we had A&W Drive-In and the Hamburger Haven, and for teenage kid, that was great. That was fine, But yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of changes, a lot of advances, but those were, it was different back then. When Longmont was 10,000, there were Hispanic families that were even in 1960 were probably been here for 3 or 4 generations. But there was discrimination back then. And again, as a teenager, we knew when we grew up, the Caucasian kids were on the west side, and the Hispanic kids and were on the east side. But when we got to high school, there was still some different groups. But I had lots of friends, different backgrounds, and I didn't really. I may have been naive, but I didn't really think that there was a lot of difference, but as years gone by, I've learned as a kid, there are things going on that you just don't really realize, and such as definitely there was redlining in terms of real estate and things like that I never, as a kid, you're not really aware of. And then, over the years, the fact that, I'll jump ahead to when early 2000s, I was on the school board for 4 years. But anyway, I learned a lot about our educational system and the fact that Longmont really I think we have a really good educational system. But even back then, there were 30 different languages, native languages, in the St. Vrain Valley School District, which to me, 20 years ago, was really, that was surprising. So, a lot of nationalities, ethnicities have become part of the 100,000, and I think that, at least personally, I think that's great. I mean, that's we talked about how it's changed. Well, that's one of the things that changes is for the better, the positive. And I think it's really a good thing. I've got fortunate enough to travel a fair amount in the fact that people everywhere, basically want security and an opportunity for their children, and that's pretty much universal around the world. And so you learn that people are really are the same, and most people have the same goals, same values. Not everybody, but most. So I think it just makes for a better world. My parents' friends and the parents of my classmates kind of all became my mentors. I can easily count at least a dozen people, men and women, who I consider my as mentors in my life, and in addition to my parents. And I think that experience was just incredible in the foundation of who I am. And you have to realize we're talking someone who's between 13 and 18 years old, so it's kind of like Mayberry, I guess. I was fortunate enough when I graduated high school I applied for and got a Becher scholarship, and I think that was largely a result of being in Longmont and the mentors I had, and several of the mentors wrote letters on my behalf in the application process, and I think that really was the groundwork. The Becher Foundation never set up this scholarship in the 1950s because they saw the need of trying to keep the students that they selected in Colorado and educated in Colorado, as opposed to going off to schools on the East Coast or the West Coast or whatever. And so it was what we call a full ride. It paid the in 1963, the total was $1,000, which is hard to believe today, but that covered basically everything. It was the tuition at CSU at the time was $113 a quarter, and the room and board was $260 a quarter, and for $25 you could buy your books. And anyway, but $1,000 then it basically paid practically all the bills. So it was really fortunate to have that. I've got several thoughts about, how students maybe approach college differently today. First of all, I'm a really believer in education as a very positive for society, and hopefully through education we can actually hopefully grow out of some of the problems we have in our country. And I think education is the foundation of some of those things. But I also think that in terms of student debt, I think part of the problem, and is the fact that there's been so much money put into education, into student loans, for instance, and that in itself has it's a good thing to get students educated, but when you put that much money into things, it causes inflation. That's one of the negatives is the inflation factor in the cost of education. But I think that we're hopefully addressing that. I think there's emphasis on trade schools. There's emphasis on community colleges. I think education is really, really important, as I said, but I don't know that everybody has to go to a traditional four-year college to become educated. And I think that one of the things that it was kind of understood, you didn't sign any contracts or anything, but that, you would give back, when you became an adult in your adulthood, you give back to the communities and to the state and the people who live in Colorado. And, I've always had that in the back of my mind when making decisions about what I would do. And so, even though I've had my own business, but I've been in several elected positions, city council and school board. And, I'm currently on the Longmont Community Foundation and the board of the Longmont Community Justice Partnership, and been on the water board and everything. So I feel like that was part of the deal when I got the scholarship, that I would try to give back to the community. Then, Longmont was just surrounded with farms and actually cattle feeding. And I don't know, as a 13, 14-year-old, I was just fascinated with agriculture. It's like, say, my dad was in banking. Obviously, I think most of our families go back far enough, we're in agriculture. But I don't know, I just was really interested in agriculture and being in the cattle business. And so as a teenager, I started working on friends that were farming their farms, learning to drive a tractor, irrigate, feed the cattle. But one group had sheep. We typically they would lamb over the Christmas vacation holidays and helping them lamb. And I decided that I would want to get in the cattle business. So when I was 18, there were some very small pastures around Longmont, and that I could rent. And I rented pasture and bought a few head of cattle and ran them in the summertime and sold them in the fall. And then I went on to CSU and studied agricultural engineering because I thought at the time that this was what they called the Sputnik era. That's the Russians had put up Sputnik, and there was really a surge of a demand for engineers. And I thought, well, if I can't get in agriculture, I didn't know how I was going to get into agriculture at the time. If I had an engineering degree, I could hopefully get a good job. So I was in agricultural engineering, which basically is kind of just a glorified civil engineer. But I got my engineering degree, but then I had the opportunity to come back to Longmont and work with the Grant family in the feed and livestock business. So I never even took my professional engineering test, but that's how I got started. My parents were very, very supportive, and I think they, now that you mentioned, I don't know that we ever really talked about it other than I took engineering in school, but my dad actually his background was actually in accounting, and I'd never taken any accounting or bookkeeping. So when I started in business, I actually learned accounting from my dad. My dad's the one who taught me bookkeeping and accounting and credits and debits and all the things that. So I actually learned from him. So, while he may not have, said a lot, I mean, he was very supportive, and yeah, it was never an issue or anything. They were. I think at least my feeling with my children and with my grandchildren is, as long as they work hard, which they do, incredibly hard, but as long as they're happy doing whatever they're doing, makes me happy. I've been in governance, I guess, since I was in grade school. I was on the student council in grade school. I was on the student council in high school. I was in student government at CSU. And when I came back to Longmont, I was on the Economic Development Council and worked with the Chamber of Commerce. And so it was kind of crazy. In 1981, it was actually when I started my own business. Our first son was born, and Jack Murphy, who was the county commissioner, the longtime county commissioner in Longmont, well known as the county fairgrounds is named for him. And Jack had 3 sons who were the same age as myself and my brother and my sister. So our families were close, and my dad was actually his treasurer for his campaigns, and he came to me. I can remember it was in June of that year. The elections were in November, and he said, "Okay, Caldwell, it's time for you to run for the city council." And I kind of like, "Oh, yeah." And we had a discussion, and I guess the rest is history. I ran and was elected, and so starting your own business, firstborn and city council all in one year, I really wouldn't recommend it. But when you're 35 years old, I guess you can do anything. So that's how it got started. And I was on the council for 4 terms, and at that point, I could have run again, but older son Reed was in high school, and Brad was coming up, and I know that when you're a parent, that when they're younger, you can mold their schedule to your schedule, but if you want to be part of your kid's life when they're in high school, that turns over, because you got to go when the events are scheduled, and they were both active in high school, so I dropped out because I knew there'd be a conflict. So starting then, so that was the end of the city council. And Longmont, as far as a city, probably delivers more services than most, from trash to recreation and of course all the plannings, water, all those things. So it was a very diverse operation, which made it very interesting. And I'd also been on the water board. Got on the water board, I guess, in 1976. So I'd been on the water board 5 or 6 years. So that gave me a little background. And then after I was on the city council, I was actually on the water board for another 18 or 20 years. So I've always been interested in water because that's one of the things I studied in college, and also being in agriculture. It's so important to agriculture, and it's also key to Longmont. And we're fortunate that the city's in a very enviable position as far as their water rights. And the reason we're in such good shape, not only the quantity, but the diverse sources. We have direct flow from St. Vrain River out of the mountains. We also have trans-mountain water rights, and we have storage, and we have exchanges, where some of these communities are totally dependent on trans-mountain water. And I think depending on that piece of it, probably has the most potential of possibly changing down the line, plus unforeseen circumstances. The big picture is the fact that with climate change, and I tell people I don't think that you can really argue we don't have climate change. I guess people can disagree maybe about what is causing it, but the point is that it's changing. I think most people are familiar with the Colorado River situation, and I think I think Longmont's in a very enviable position. I don't think that. I think we're going to be fine. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, is that I've seen the numbers in the last I think it's 15 years, whatever it is, the increase from 83,000 people to 100,000. I guess it's the last 10 or 15 years. Our water consumption has been flat. So through the conservation that people are doing, whether it's xeriscape or whatever they're doing, is it's working in terms of water, electricity, internet, all several of the infrastructure. A lot of people take for granted, but if you really study it and understand what's going on in other communities, Longmont's is a very enviable position in a number of ways. There are a lot more services. The city's it's more diverse. One of the things that I've done, I have an office in downtown Longmont. I've had an office for 40 years. I try to walk as many days as I can when I don't need a car, so I walk. And one of the things I miss is when we were in the back, when there were 10,000 people, and I also worked out on the farm, some farms here, and you'd go by and, people would always, wave, hi. And, that was one of the things I missed. And I also think that it's something that, it's a little thing, but I think that it really sends a message. So when I'm walking and I say hello, and when cars go by, because the streets are really wide, so actually I walk on the edge of the street. So I just, every car goes by, I just kind of do a little wave. And I'd guess 50% of the time, the cars that I can actually see somebody that responds, and I just think that if people have that attitude of, we're neighbors and we're friends, intimacy, neighborliness, connectedness, friendliness. The worst case is that's kind of a funny old guy, but it's nice that he's waving at everybody. So I just think that brings back a little bit of what it was like, 65 years ago.